being admitted now. Welcome everybody. I will go ahead and do the introductions, and just so everybody knows, hi Renaud, I will be, our speaker has kindly agreed to talk to us for about 45 minutes, and after that we will have time for questions. This session is being recorded, as we do like to document our webinars here at the center. So let me begin by just saying, before I introduce our speaker, that this is our first event for some time. We have been waylaid by the pandemic, like many institutions, and we have now adapted, maybe a bit more slowly than some other institutions, by using Zoom. But we're very pleased indeed that we're back, even if only virtually. We do hope by next semester to have our sessions in person, of course. The university now has a policy, if you're not from CityU, that you have to register, but that can be done for registration. And I appreciate everybody sharing their information with us, because we'd like to put you on our mailing list. I think, Angel, you have the information on all our guests, so we can send you announcements about future talks. And as I just mentioned, I'll mention it this time, next year will be our 20th anniversary, so we're looking forward to that. This is 20 years of Southeast Asian studies in Hong Kong, where unfortunately Southeast Asia is not always given the emphasis it could be, given its physical proximity to Hong Kong, and of course the large number of Southeast Asians here, and the issues in Southeast Asia, if you think about Thailand at the moment, that clearly parallel what is going on or has gone on recently in Hong Kong. So welcome everybody. One other item on the agenda before introducing our speaker, sorry Enze, I'll get to you, is I'd like to introduce our new Associate Director, Dr. Diego Fossetti. Dr. Fossetti is also in the Department of Asian International Studies and is a specialist on Indonesia, and has been at CityU now for a couple of years, which he says he loves.
We love it.
So we're very pleased indeed, both that Diego joined us here at CityU a couple of years ago, but also that he's now Associate Director of CERC. He has a very prolific research background in the study of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And so we're very pleased indeed. And we're hoping in the next semester, Diego and I, to come up with a usual CERC full program. However, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Enze Han, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Hong Kong. And he's interested in the politics of China, China's relationship with Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on borderland areas. He's received financial support from such prestigious institutions as the Leverhulme Trust. For those of you who are familiar with the UK system, that's a very prestigious trust fellowship indeed. And I think also of importance, great importance to mention at this point, is his recent publication about called Asymmetrical Neighbors, an Oxford University Press book that came out last year. And this book focuses on the issue of borderlands. And indeed, that's what his talk is speaking about in terms of China's relations with Southeast Asia. So I think I'll leave it at there. And again, thank Dr. Han, thank Enze for joining us. And again, apologies that this is only virtual, but we very much look forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. So I will start sharing my PowerPoint. Okay, all right. So hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. All right. So this is I would say this is a talk. This is a work in progress, and then I just recently started to think about how to conceptualize different ways of understanding the presence of China in Southeast Asia, but also like broadly, globally speaking. So that's why I used a very big title, sort of influences, unintended consequences, and the ripple effects, conceptualizing the presence of China in Southeast Asia. So the starting point is, recent years there being a new trend in literature try to study the presence of China globally, and particularly as a result of the going out process of Chinese capital and Chinese investment, and also many state enterprises, and then as well as ordinary Chinese citizens going around the world for businesses, etc. Then there is this phenomenon of global China, right? So like Qinhuan Li, who's a sociologist at UCLA, for example, talks about the variety of forms that global China has taken, right? From state-led investment to many other forms of labor relations, as well as civil society and other forms of presence globally. However, when we think about the relation between China and Southeast Asia, conventionally, a lot of people tend to use the terminology, for example, power asymmetry. So in a sense that this is a terminology that tap onto the power differential between China as a great power versus the relatively smaller states in the region, but somehow in the neighborhood of China's, in China's neighborhood to the south. So many times scholars working on this kind of angle, right, tend to look at some of those conventional measurement of power, right? So look at economic relations, that China as ASEAN's biggest trading partner, and increasingly also one of the largest FDI source, and then at the same time, as a great power, has also enjoy superior military power balance over the Southeast Asian neighbors. However, on the other hand, China is not necessarily a typical conventional great power for many countries in Southeast Asia, and partly because of the geographical proximity between the two. And then that means that you do have lots of non-state actors coming out from China who have tremendous amount of presence or that footprint in the region, right? So you, on the one hand, for example, you can have like big state-owned enterprises who have investment in Southeast Asia, but you also have lots of Chinese like labor coming to compete for jobs in the region as well. Similarly, you have lots of private capital going to Southeast Asia to look for opportunities of investment, and etc. So in a sense, there are multifaceted presence of this China in the region. So that basically prompted me to think about some of those conceptual differences that people often have in conventional IR literature, talking about power. Generally speaking, for example, is often defined as the ability of a country to shape politics in line with its interest. And often that measurement, that is often measured in terms of economic power and also military resources. And sometimes people also use, soft power, cultural values. But still, these are the very conventional definitions of what power is. Basically, it's kind of latent capability. However, power itself is not different, is not the same as influence itself. And then, for example, according to this definition given by Evelyn Goh, she talked about influence as different from power. In a sense, power is more of a latent capability, but the influence is the actual effective exercise of power. Right, so then the emphasis is looking at the act of modifying or otherwise having impact upon other actors' preferences of behavior in favor of one's aims. However, in many of those kind of literature talking about Chinese influence abroad, often there is this, there are two, I would say, limit of public bias. One is they're often very state-centric in the sense that we look at Chinese influence, usually these kind of studies often look at the state, right, as the Chinese state basically are doing particular things in its foreign policy. And then on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier in the definition, is the actual effective exercise of power, and then there is lots of emphasis on the intentionality in the sense that the outcome is, generally speaking, is directly related with intention of the state. In a sense, the state try to influence and then have a consequence that come out from this influence. However, there are also many realms of these things that can be categorized into these so-called unintended consequences of purposive social action, right? So this is basically a terminology that came up by Robert Merton in a very old 1936 piece on the same title, basically, Unanticipated Consequences of Purposive Social Action. So the nutshell of the argument essentially is that social actions often have unintended consequences that differ from the original goal. So basically, with complex interactions that constitute society, and then the consequences are not necessarily usually occur in the specific areas that they were intended to, right? And sometimes they can be interrelated and consequences that, and then there's lots of interactions that can come up in the targeted country, right? Or in general. So this is essentially prompt me to think through whether we can think of ways of change, ways of political transformations or economic changes in the region, in Southeast Asia, that are related with certain actions coming out from China, but then they are not necessarily intended, nor necessarily directly related with the state. So that's essentially the phenomenon I try to describe today, is this unintended consequences of China's presence in Southeast Asia. And I will focus mainly on northern Myanmar. This is where my fieldwork, past year, basically, not this year, obviously, but in 2019, basically mostly around the Lashio area. So there's so Lashio is here. It's sort of a major town in northern Xiang state on the way to the Chinese border. So that's where I'm going to tell 3 stories, and then they all come from this sort of the context. Essentially, is this the major entryway of Myanmar's trade to China, land trade to China. So this main road from Mandalay, somewhere here, to Muse via Lashio. This is the main main road connecting Myanmar with China, and I would say the majority of the land trade between China and Myanmar go through this road, right? So this is very sort of a busy road, and you have lots of, and similarly, at the same time, you will see there are a few areas in the borderland. Some of them are controlled by different ethnic armed groups, but then so you also have different other entryways, but main one is still this the Mandalay Lashio Muse road. So I will tell 3 stories that are connected with this trans-border trade networks and its implications. The first phenomenon that I looked at is the expansion of maize corn cultivation and deforestation in northern Myanmar in the past decade. So this is some pictures around Lashio. You can see that lots of those, there's really like large scale of corn plantations, and many times, because corn, different from rice, is not so dependent upon being flat, sort of a paddy rice kind of a condition, and they can actually be planted in a slope. So that means many of those hills, the trees have been cleared away for corn, maize plantations. So the first, let's look at some statistics, right? So in Myanmar in general, and that in the past decade, there has been an accelerated rate of deforestation in the country. And so according to the data by Global Forest Change data set, and an estimate about 95% of forest has been lost since 2000 and 2019. So the average annual rate of 0.5% of deforestation rate. And previously, and most of the previous studies on deforestation, particularly the ones came out in 2000s, and then those ones tend to look at the timber trade. And previously, there's lots of illegal timber trade, and then sort of tied together with ethnic armed groups, in particular, like in Kachin state, etc. And then lots of this blame usually looking at those kind of illegal timber trade and its implications on deforestation. But since 2014, Myanmar government officially banned raw timber trade, and then so obviously, you know, illegal timber trade is still going on, but then the volume of that has gone down quite a bit. And then so that's why for the past decade also, most of these kind of things happening in northern Myanmar are in some ways interrelated with timber trade earlier. In a sense that lots of places, for example, when timber were cut down, and then you know, they'll be replaced by cash crops, right? And so that's why there is a general pattern of agricultural expansion, right? In terms of obviously lots of cash crops such as rubber, sugar canes, bananas, etc. But also in this case is corn. So the reason why corn expanded so dramatically in the past decade there is due to two factors. The first factor is the global commodity price for corn has gone up tremendously. So you can see this, the left chart is the global commodity price for corn, for maize. Basically in 2011 and 12, there is a big spike of price for maize. And part of that because of the reasons for that spike was in the US, and US domestic use of corn for ethanol production basically led to the price of corn basically shot up, and internationally the price all went up. So which means that when the global price for corn went up, and then it became increasingly profitable for farmers in Myanmar to think about to make money, right, out from the corn. So there's a market kind of demand kind of relationship. And indeed, we see that the corn production in Myanmar basically also sort of follow the same pattern. The global price gone up, and Myanmar's the corn production basically went up relatively around the same time. But then the price gone up, but then you also need the market to sell to, right? And this is basically the good timing of it essentially is that the domestic Chinese demand for corn is also going up. And this is because of the reason, this is because of the long, sort of like because of long-term economic growth, and then the demand for consumption of meat, particularly chicken and the pork, and they all demand animal feed, right? So basically those corns are used to produce those feed for the animal production domestically in China. And also domestic Chinese price for corn is actually higher than international price. And generally speaking, that you can see the chart here is basically overall the domestic Chinese price for corn is almost like 1/3 higher than international price. So this means that the tremendous amount of demand within Chinese market, and then you also have the international market price for corn is going up. So that is basically an ideal combination of factors basically made China a natural outlet for Myanmar's maize, right? And so this is because the geographical proximity and also non-porous border. So in a sense that you know, most of the corns produced in Myanmar end up in China. They don't really, there's not many other channels for the corn to be exported. Rather because the price is higher in China, there's a big demand in China. So that's why people will try and find ways to enter the Chinese market. So that's basically was the reason that expansion of maize cultivation in the Shan state basically went up. And you can see that the expansion of the maize and also deforestation has a regional variation within the Shan state. And this is definitely more so in Shan State North. So in generally speaking, the Shan State, it's a big state, right? It's the biggest state within Myanmar. And generally speaking, people divide Shan State into 3 parts, right? So you have Shan State South, which is Dangji, and sort of like centered around Dangji. And then usually that area is more oriented towards Thailand. And then you have Northern Shan State, so around Lashio, and that's basically going to China. And then you have the eastern part of Shan State, sort of like east of Salween River. And then that's like around like Jiangdong area. And that's sort of in between China and Thailand. And so similarly, you can see that the northern Shan State actually has higher deforestation rate than either the Shan State East as well as Shan State South. And then similarly, this is the another graph basically tell you how along the road from Mandalay to Lashio, and basically that is around 2011, 12, basically, and afterwards the deforestation rate along the road has basically gone up as a result of the proximity to the Chinese market, right? There's basically expansion of corn plantation along the road to as a way to be easy transportation essentially to the Chinese market. But there's a twist here, in a sense that the twist is that technically Myanmar corn are forbidden from import to China for two reasons. First, corn is considered as a national grain security item. So corn, such as together with the rice and other things, are subject to a quota, import quota system, right? So annually, the Chinese government put the corn quota as 7.2 million ton of corn can be imported, and because China itself is also a large corn maize producer. But on the other hand, Myanmar's, so that's first, there's a quota restriction. But even without the quota restriction, Myanmar's corn are still also cannot enter Chinese market legally, because the import disease inspection quarantine mechanisms has been placed, and the Myanmar government has not signed any such agreement with the Chinese government to have this kind of inspection mechanisms ready, right? So which means that Myanmar's corn cannot legally enter the Chinese market. But however, all those corn somehow end up in the Chinese market, because many of them, most of them basically were smuggled through the border. The smuggling obviously is a very rampant but also easy thing, because the border has been so long, right? It's more than 2,000 kilometers of border, and then in regular times, the border inspection is often not enforced. However, at particular periods of time, you do have like irregular enforcement of border inspections, and that basically create ripples through the production cycle. So in a sense, in 2018, 2019, for example, the story was that the Chinese border inspections has been more stringent in the inspections, and that means that many of those farmers cannot sell their corn because the trade is not going through. So the result is that many farmers that in the previous years they anticipated, for example, that there'll be such amount of corn can be produced and it can be sold to Chinese market, but then because of the border inspection, and then somehow they have to hold them at home and wait for the time then the restriction on border inspection will be eased. But the problem here is that most of the farmers in northern Myanmar, so the corn is different from, let's say, sugarcane or other type of cash crop, in a sense like sugarcane, for example, requires quite a lot of capital. Similar for other type of cash crop, rubber or banana, it's not something you can do by ordinary families, right? It's usually those other type of cash crop require like lots of like capital investment. So usually suitable for large business, but not for family household economy. But corn is relatively easy to do on a family basis. Usually people have some let's say, so in Myanmar, they differentiate regular field versus mountain field, right? So Dangya refers to the mountain field. Mountain field is basically every family, some villages, for example, have certain allocations of Dangya, and that's the mountain slopes that they can plant things. So that's why it's a very common thing for households to take on corn plantation. But to get access to corn plantation, particularly for the type of seed that is high producing, so which is usually people use a Thai seed. It's like A08 as a brand of the corn, but they usually have to borrow money from some kind of loan sharks, or like some kind of like financial entity. So the problem is that when you have a schism between the commodity production cycle, right? You basically anticipate, for example, a certain amount of output next year, but then when the border inspection became irregular, then that can then create problems for farmers in the large area, basically create lots of uncertainty, but also precarity for finance. Lots of the stories were essentially that the poorer families are much more vulnerable for loans, and basically unpayment of loans that in the end lead to let's say land sales and land grabbing and etc. So this is the unintended consequences of those border inspections, and then have on the farming communities in northern Myanmar. So that's the first story. The second story is about cattle trade, also for the Chinese market. So these are the few pictures I took outside Mandalay. So this is basically there are lots of these kind of most of the cattle are not produced in the area. Usually they are assembled throughout the country, and they'll be shipped to Mandalay, and then they put in like a common area, and then this is the place lots of trade, let's say, bidders will come to bid on the prices of those cattle, and then they'll be put on a truck and then basically try to ship it to the Chinese border. So that's the area in Mandalay. You have lots of this kind of a cattle assembly congregation kind of places. So same story as earlier, that big demand for beef, for meat in the Chinese market. And according to this data from last year, essentially China right now is the second largest consumer of beef, less than the US, and also increasingly, and different from the US, is that most of Chinese beef are actually imported, and domestic production cannot satisfy the demand for beef. And in fact, most of the beef in the Chinese market came from Brazil, and Argentina, Australia, and then the US. But usually they are frozen. They're not really like live, they're not like fresh meat. So that's basically the market share that the Myanmar beef is supposed to satisfy. Essentially, they are live cattle, and then they can be freshly butchered and sold to the Chinese consumers, right? And so, and estimated basically in 2015, for example, 500,000 cattle have been smuggled into China. Now, the reason is that previously the Myanmar government did not permit live cattle export. But on the other hand, obviously, cattle are being smuggled through the border anyway, because the border has been so long, right? It's very difficult to enforce some kind of mechanism to inspect the border. So Myanmar government legalized cattle export in 2017. However, the legalization on the Myanmar side does not mean that the cattle can legally enter the Chinese market, because China officially did not allow Myanmar cattle to be imported until 2020. That's when they signed agreement on how to enforce a bovine export inspection and quarantine mechanism. So that previously the cattle legally exported by Myanmar usually are not legally imported to China, right? There is lots of gray zones. So the trend of it, however, is that for the past few years, is that the cattle trade has becoming more legalized, in a sense that both governments, the Myanmar government as well as the Chinese government, saw an interest to legalize this trade, because previously that too many cattle have been smuggled through the border, and then often, sometimes many of them probably will carry diseases, and then they're not really sort of good for domestic stocks, right? So that's why they try to legalize the trade. So you see this, the trend to legalize the trade. However, so the legalization process in China occurs through different steps. The Chinese government originally designated 2 cities as this sort of experimental zone for live cattle import from Myanmar. So one is will be in Dehong. Dehong is a prefecture in Yunnan's in southern Yunnan. So this is Dehong. The other one is it will be in Jinghong. That's Sichuan-Banna. It's on the other side, close to Lao border, right? That's mostly targeted towards the Lao and the Vietnam import. So which means that the Chinese state designated the Dehong as the legal entry point for Myanmar beef. But the problem is that there is, in fact, regional competition within Yunnan in different prefectures. They all try to have a slice of those profitable cattle trade, because they, when the cattle are butchered, because usually, generally speaking, Myanmar cattle price is half of domestic Chinese price for beef, right? So the profit margin is quite high, and then so if you can effectively operate a butcher industry, and then you can make quite a lot of money, sell them. So that's why you have different other regional prefectural governments, like in Baoshan, in Lincang, etc. They are encouraging the beef to be transported via those places, which means that they encourage the illegal ones to come in rather than the legal ones coming through the Lashio Muse. That's the main entry point, right? So they in some ways, so Dehong, Baoshan is here, and then Lincang is in this area. So that means most of those cattle will come from Bamo, and then also from like the Wa area, entering the Chinese market, and so which means domestically there's this competition for the beef. At the same time, the legalization of the cattle trade create problems for the domestic Myanmar cattle exporters, because now cattle export has become a legal enterprise instead of an illegal one. Then the Myanmar government now want to put tax on those trade, right? However, this is a region you have a variety of ethnic arms groups operating in the region. So many of those ethnic arms groups previously do tax those cattle trade going to China illegally via different channels. So usually the live cattle trade to China, as I mentioned early on, right? They were assembled in Mandalay and they put on a truck, and then they basically went to China, right? But usually the end route to enter China is not through trucks. Usually you will have some kind of like young man come to herd them by human force through the border, right? Across, because the border is too porous. Usually you go through these very primitive modes of transportation, then the cattle will be smuggled into China. So which means previously you have to pass those mountainous areas that are often under the control of those ethnic armed groups, and usually those groups will tax them, right? They will tax the cattle trade to get the money out of it. But the problem is right now the government start to put a taxation on top of that, and then they create double taxation on part of the cattle exporters, and this business become increasingly not as profitable as before. At the same time, along the main routes along the main road from Mandalay to Lashio to Muse, increasingly you have the ethnic armed groups come in to put a roadblock and to try to get like a levy on the trade going to China. So this is basically has probably particularly since 2018 and 19, there's intensification of armed conflict in northern Myanmar. So you can see this map, right, most of those conflicts are concentrated around northern Shan state. So that means that this main road actually is very subject to this kind of like takeover. So even like so I was in Lashio in December 2019, and then they were talking about basically basically every time you're going from one town to the other one, you have to pass lots of those kind of barricades, and most of them set up by government. But then periodically, for example, some armed groups will come down to put a barricade and they demand money. So that basically because the cattle trade has become too profitable, and that's why they are also big target for those armed groups try to have a cut on the profit from the cattle trade. So in a sense, there is this kind of political economic logic that basically are feeding into the intensive fighting among ethnic armed groups in the region. So this is the second story. The last story I'm going to talk about is about the jade trade. So obviously Myanmar's jade. So China has been Myanmar's largest jade trading partner, because jade is a very special product that only the Chinese like, right? It is not really a sort of internationally sought after item. And so estimates of Myanmar's trade on jade is very difficult. There are different estimates around, like some, so for example, the high end basically put it almost 50% of Myanmar's GDP, and then you have a low end estimate that basically put it as 2% of GDP. But overall, the number is very high, right? Basically, it's one of the biggest export by Myanmar to China. And then still, Jade trade, as the ones I mentioned earlier, has always been associated with illegality and smuggling, right? And partly because the jade mines usually are under the control of government forces, but also lots of armed groups in Kachin state. And the smuggling has always been one of the dominant form of transportation to China. But there are some recent developments that came as a result of domestic Chinese changes of consumer behavior. So this is basically is so-called online streaming of jade sales. So these are the pictures that I took in Ruili, which is right outside the Muse, the main gate to China, to Myanmar. So this is basically a jade market. But you can see that all the people are doing the sales via a cell phone, through a mobile phone, right? And this is because these days people don't buy jade in person anymore. And the biggest forms, the largest the dominant forms of sales for jade has becoming the so-called online streaming. The Chinese call it 直播. So basically everything is live streamed, and then you can buy directly from the seller. The idea, right? Essentially, the customers based in China, actually many in Taiwan as well, they buy through those online sales platforms, Taobao and many other ones. They have a live streaming sales room, and that's where you go in, and then you buy those jade directly from the source, right? Well, that was the concept. You buy directly from the source. So the increasing popularity of these modes of sales of jade has deep implications in Myanmar's case. First, it intensified the importance of ethnic Chinese networks. In a sense, if you don't have a connection with the ethnic Chinese network, you can forget about how to make money from this Chinese market, particularly because those online platforms are basically predominantly Chinese in language. So there is not really for international it's not like a platform run through English medium or other things. It's like I would say 100% in Chinese, right? So which means that the importance of ethnic Chinese marks is increasingly important. This is also because that the payment system via those online sales have to go through Chinese portals, many such as WeChat or Alipay, right? At the same time, you also have lots of Chinese nationals who now come to Myanmar, many in Mandalay as well as in Railay, etc. They are the Railay and Mandalay. They are the two areas of lots of people come directly to those places and try to sell those jade via that mobile phone to the customers back in China. So this kind of phenomenon that basically, on the one hand, somehow cut off the Myanmar's middlemen in a way that previously you have lots of jade traders in those places that they're run by Myanmar nationals, but then increasingly the Chinese nationals are coming to have a cut of this trade. But on the other hand, the online payment systems that, as I mentioned, right, the money have to go through the Chinese WeChat or Alipay, that make it actually really difficult for the Myanmar government to monitor how much transaction has been going on, right? And so that the direct outcome of that is that there is a loss of tax revenue for the Myanmar government. And then the official Jade Trade, so that you see this kind of discrepancy in a sense, the official jade export in Myanmar is going down, but the official Chinese import of jade number has been relatively stable. So that means you have quite a lot of the increasingly more those decentralized, particularly this kind of version of decentralized jade sales encouraged further smuggling of jade, usually through relatively small volumes to the Chinese market. So these basically are the three stories that I tell today, right? So this is and all those things happen not because of any particular intention that by the Chinese state that they want to, for example, have deforestation in Myanmar or have smuggling of a cattle trade or have make Myanmar government to lose tax revenues from the jade sales, right? But they are, in some ways, there are unintended consequences that just basically came as a byproduct of what's happening within China itself, right? Totally irrelevant perhaps for Myanmar itself. But also that means basically, so the theoretical takeaway from today, from my talk is that first we have to probably moving beyond a very state-centric view of Chinese influence, in the sense that most of these kind of things that are happening, particularly in Southeast Asia, partly because of the geographical proximity and all other things, that you have tremendous amount of non-state presence but have deep implications for the region. So in some ways, I think that the idea is that we have to move beyond a state-centric view of influence of China in the region. The second one I want to emphasize is that there are a variety of influences due to China's multifaceted presence in the region. Some are probably intentional, right? So you do have, for example, like military coercion or lobbying foreign governments, and these are definitely intentional exercise of Chinese influence in the region. But you also have many things happening at the same time that are not intended by the Chinese state, but somehow they do have wide-ranging implications, either on the targeted state as well as on the society at large, right? And particularly in many of those very mundane everyday forms of trading relations, the people who are affected quite directly are often the ordinary people, farmers, traders, and other things. They're not necessarily the state, but then they do have wide-ranging implications. Thank you very much, and I will stop here. And now I'm very looking forward to your comments and questions and suggestions for how this whole project can improve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Enze. That's an interesting amount of empirical findings, which is fascinating for us, particularly now that we're Hong Kong bound. You have managed to transport us not just to Myanmar generally, but to the Shan State in particular. And with these three stories, tell us some very interesting aspects of what is going on in the relationship between the two countries, moving away from a state-centric perspective. Perhaps I can abuse my privilege as chair to ask the first question, but others can jump in just after this. And that is, if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what exactly we have learned from these three stories and how they are unintended consequences. So as I piece it together, we see on the one hand, the Myanmar government losing tax revenues. On the other hand, corn getting into China, even though it's not supposed to be getting in the way it is. So even though, that presumably on the one hand is something that the Chinese government doesn't want because it wants to have control of imports of this valuable commodity for them, this commodity that's part of their national security, food security. And on the other hand, these valuable revenues for the Myanmar government potentially that are being lost. For the average, person involved in the China market in Myanmar in these two aspects anyway, this is a win situation for them. They're paying less in taxes to their own government, and they're getting to import a corn into China, even though they're not supposed to be. So maybe is one of the points of this project perhaps that the little guys are winning out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. What I'm saying is not necessarily the little guys are winning. First of all, it's basically like, in any state regulation, when you have regulation, you also have illegality. Illegality is often related, conceptually with regulation itself, right? So without regulation, obviously everything's okay. But if you start to regulate things, then you produce illegality out of it. But for me, the purpose of the talk is of the project is more. I'm trying to move beyond the as I mentioned earlier, the conventional literature look at inference, the very state-centric and also very strong emphasis on intentionality of it. There is not enough sort of focus on the unintended consequences of foreign policy or foreign relations in general. So that's basically I think that the theoretical lacuna that I'm looking at essentially is the how can we conceptualize, understand, particularly when people talk about like presence of China. What does that mean, right? People talk about that all the time, right? Like the presence of China around the world, but many of the things happening are not really directly related with the state at all. But ultimately, they're all tied together with the state. So there is this kind of the things that I try to lay out is there are lots of things happening in Southeast Asia. They are not necessarily directly related with the state, either intentionally or it's intention, right? But they do have deep implications, right, on ordinary people's lives. So this is, in some ways, for me, is to push open some of the theoretical avenues of how we can understand different facets of China's presence. Yeah, so that's essentially my purpose.
Thanks very much. I think, Enze, it'd probably be easier if you just field questions yourself.
All right, okay.
Normally, I stand in to try to field them, but I think, so if you can, yes, please, let's admit another guest. But yeah, I see Renaud and then Yufei, and then, well, you can take it from there, Enze.
Okay, all right. So Renaud, why don't you go first?
All right. Good evening, Enze. It's good to have you here. Thank you for coming, even if only virtually. I just want to follow up with your answer here on your theoretical takeaway. I mean, I know it's a work in progress, and then it's just at the stage of a project. But I have a concern here. Don't you think that, I mean, you want to look at beyond this state-centric view of the Chinese influence, but it seems to me that there is already a scholarship on this. It's the diaspora studies scholarship.
Okay.
Many scholars have looked at the influence of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar, whether it's they are following the foreign policy of the central government, they are taking advantage of it, or they are going against it. I mean, there is a literature here of these intended or unintended consequences of the presence of overseas Chinese communities, including in northern Myanmar. So I'm just wondering if, how your project fits into this thinking by other scholars, and especially scholars of the diaspora. And then just two small questions more related to your case studies. First, we are now living in time of pandemics. You're talking about porous borders, but it seems to me that China has been very successful in closing down the borders, particularly the Myanmar Yunnan borders. There are tons of sugar canes, of bananas that have been stuck on the Burmese side of the borders because the Chinese authorities have been efficient in closing down the border. So I'm just wondering if that would be an issue when you look at those cross-border trades that, whether it's jade, whether it's corn, cattle, can you bring a new reflection on the current situation? And lastly, I'm looking at also, I've been looking at Jade Trade. You're noticing new patterns in this trade, so with the online trade. But don't you think here you are looking at small price, that the big chunk of trade is either completely out of sight? Because here, if you look at WeChat, if you look at Alipay, that's legal trade that is visible to everybody, including the Chinese government and the Burmese government, even if the Burmese government cannot tax those trades. But don't you think that most of the Jade trade is done elsewhere, not on WeChat, not on Alipay, so that you would be looking at only a minor or a marginal type of trade, so it might be difficult to draw a conclusion on that afterwards.
Okay.
But yeah, okay, sorry, I spoke too long, but yeah, I would be happy to get your views on this. Yeah. Thanks.
So the first question, whether previous studies on diaspora has touched upon a similar topic, and I think it's quite different. Like I don't think the focus of my talk is actually on diaspora particularly, because for me those kind of ordinary forms of globalization can talk about like that kind of way, right? In terms of the trading patterns, trading relations across the border. Obviously diasporas are often involved, but they're not necessarily they are the whole thing, right? And so my theoretical entry point is actually not on diaspora studies. Rather, it's on the IR literature on inference and power inference, etc. And then I think, but especially on those smuggling, etc. These are very common forms of ordinary forms of globalization. People talk about those like IPE studies have some versions of it, talk about illegality and smuggling, etc. But they're not necessarily related with diaspora studies. So I don't know like whether that's what you think I am actually talking about diaspora studies, but in my story actually the Chinese overseas China dimension is relatively minor. They are not really directly involved. Some of it obviously are involved, but within the Myanmar itself, particularly the cattle trade, and many of the people who were in that business mostly were ethnic armed groups. They're not necessarily like diaspora people, right? Now, the second one about COVID, and yes, so Myanmar's agriculture is very dependent upon Chinese market, and then so I've seen some media reports basically saying that lots of fruits and vegetables are being rotten in a field because now the Chinese the market has shut down, and then the people cannot sell, right? And this is a problem because like so Myanmar is extremely dependent on Chinese market for lots of its fruits and vegetables. Like for example, like almost all the, like they will say 80% or 90% of Myanmar's watermelons are destined for the Chinese market, and same for many other type of crops as well. So this uncertain time, extraordinary time of COVID, definitely means that those kind of very porous and frequent trade networks now basically are shut down or are temporarily suspended. Let's put it that way, because I do think that that changes. So at one point, actually, the border was open. So you have during COVID time, right? First you have the February, March, and that's when China was really bad, right? And then the border was shut down. And then later on, they started opening the trade with Myanmar. And then the past week or so, a month or so, and then the Myanmar's the COVID infection rate gone up again, and then the border has been much more sort of again more stringently controlled, and partly because there was one incident was some Burmese national, Myanmar national came to China and then she was positive or something. So that was the story. Anyway, so I think COVID definitely put lots of those kind of things into question, right? I mean, even in Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong's trade with Singapore, with Shenzhen, right, along the border. I mean, that's previously so frequent, like a cross-border trade, but now all those things has, at least for those like parallel traders, they're now out of a job. Now, the last one about how much of those the trade, the Jade I'm talking about actually is going through online versus the big chunk of things, right? Now, I think that first of all, I don't know how one can compare the big amount of Jade, the actual amount of Jade, and who are the main ones like being played. But I do think there is something special about the online version ones. Essentially, is that in fact it involves some kind of decentralization of power. So which means that now lots of people can sell rather than like wholesale kind of monopoly by big players, right? So I do see that, like for example, these days if you go to really seems that now everywhere you go it's online streaming. Then nobody talk about any other forms of trade anymore. So it definitely means that it is a very popular, trendy ways of things being transacted through this mode. So that's why I cannot really put a number on it, is how like percentage of shares was done online versus, but I don't think it's a small one. I think that the domestic market for Jade is quite big. That's why these days, if you go, you will see that basically pretty much everybody's doing this. So that seems quite to indicate to me is quite substantial. All right, Yufei.
Hey, Professor Han, really nice to see you again. I really enjoyed the talk, and you touched upon a few points that are also relevant to my own dissertation, which is the political effect of migration, of new Chinese migration. I agree that with Professor Renaud that there is a lot of literature on diaspora studies, but the new Chinese migrants, they harbor some new qualities that make them distinct from previous cohorts. For example, their relationship with China, many of them retain very close ties. Even their main customers, as the Jade Trade shows, they are the Chinese middle class market. And I have tracked in different countries that similar phenomena. For example, the online gambling in the Philippines. For example, the tourism, the tour guide, mainland Chinese tour guide working in Bali Island, that crowding out the local business, local tour guide. But a lot of those were actually directly related to sometimes they are countering the policy of the Chinese state. For example, the gambling is a big major concern for capital control, but the unintended consequence of that kind of presence is that they affect the local community negatively, and they can trigger some reaction. But that reaction may not be only to the tour guides and the gambling workers themselves, but toward the Chinese state. And that can have a lot of impact. So I really think that we should actually integrate the study of goods and trade of goods, and also the migration people, to really think about how we can conceptualize this phenomenon. And another question I have is a normative one. I think to paraphrase Fareed Zakaria, the CNN host, he asked a question. He said, given so the West has been very careful and very sensitive to the influence China is now precising and its presence everywhere. But he asked this question, like, given China's economic weight and its population size being 1/5 of humanity, how much influence should China have? That is a question that a lot of people in the West haven't answered, or because we chase China's influence here and there, but how much should it be? Like, that normative question seems to remain unanswered, and especially true for regions that are so close to China. How much influence should China have, both the state and non-state, in the region that is most close to China? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. So first one, I think, there is definitely a separate literature in political economy talk about everyday forms of political economy, right? But usually, so that this sort of studies that looking at those kind of daily transactions and how they change, how they affect political economic logics and etc. Then to your second question, in terms of how what should be normative question of how much influence China should have. I don't know. I think the answer to that question is difficult. But I think for particularly for Southeast Asia, and then one factor people cannot easily ignore, I think, and also that has not been talked about very much, is demography. I actually do think that size of Chinese people have strong implications, either good or bad, like for Southeast Asia, right? And the sheer amount of people who can consume, but also who can come out to do lots of things, and that is historically a main concern for countries in Southeast Asia, is about labor export from China, right? I mean, from colonial period to today, even, right? The most of the concerns like Thai government has in terms of signing this high-speed rail deal with China is basically do not import Chinese labor to do the job, because that would take away job from Thai local Thai people, right? So same kind of thing. Basically, many governments continue to have a suspicion that if they open the gate, and then the local people cannot survive in a competition with the cheap labor coming from China, or so that's basically in some ways a convention. I would say it is a conventional, long-term historical concern for countries in Southeast Asia. So it's basically about the fear of China's economic dominance through its human force, right? It's number of people. So that's why I think these kind of questions that is very difficult to answer, right? Normatively, like how much influence China should have. Just because of its size, but I don't think but what I try to emphasize is that basically is the size of the demography is such that its influence are going to be felt definitely more in the future, in the years to come, right? In terms of when more people become middle class, they want to consume more things. They also will go abroad to do tourism, right? And that's the numbers show up. Like you can see that Thailand right now already like 1/4 of tourism came from China, right? So So these days, for example, many times people think that very much a, I mean, okay, so I'll use a counterexample of this, right? Will be, so if you ever travel to the to the Caribbean or to Mexico and then to Central America, you find Americans everywhere, right? And lots of all the let's say resorts, right, are run by Americans or in American standards, use US dollars, and then everybody speak English. And so that I would say is in some ways, you know, very typical, because the American US is much more, much richer and more influential in the region. That's why everybody had to cater to that standard, as that kind of market. And I think that probably the similar things will happen in the Chinese neighborhood as well. With number of people going abroad, and then you will find similar patterns, things will emerge. And I think that is something people have to get ready for, if they're not already doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, I just to add final point, I think if you look at the people who work in those places, if you look at how many Western expats working in Thailand, and we should also expect that number of Chinese expats wanting to work there, not because the state, but because they have their dreams and their wishes and their mobilities to see the broad, and just like anyone else in joining the middle class.
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, Thailand and Malaysia also have retirement visas, and then you trust me, a lot more people in the future will try to retire in those places, and many probably coming from China.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Other questions?
This is the chance for everybody to join into our discussion. While we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts, I wondered if I could follow up on the question that Yufei asked about illegal gambling. I realize this is a different case in the Philippines, but I think that does kind of capture a very interesting aspect, which is, you know, that the Chinese state is getting blamed for things it itself doesn't want.
Right. So this
and I think if I say it, just add about Myanmar. So Myanmar is fascinating because, you know, even though the Chinese state is noted to be a powerful state, Myanmar, of course, less so, particularly in the north where it's so fragmented with these ethnic groups and so on, and armed opposition. You know, there is a lot going on that doesn't have much of that's not much state control, and yet, you know, this gets put into this category of China-Myanmar or China-Philippine relations. It is kind of interesting, and part of what China is confronting, it seems, is simply the dangers of being, you know, such an increasingly important power. And with so much money involved, and you know, the online gambling, Yufei probably knows this better than I do, but we're, as far as I know, we're talking about, you know, huge amounts of money. And I can just imagine what the Jade Trade is worth. I've noted the prices in Hong Kong for some Jade items. I suppose they're already quite a bit up the ladder in terms of you know, what you pay for the artistry and so on. But I mean, they're just extraordinary prices. So we're talking on huge amounts of money, and the state is very limited in its ability to control it, and yet it gets the blowback.
Right. So same with the illegal gambling, definitely, right? I mean, you see, like along the Chinese border with Myanmar and Laos, previously lots of casinos run along the border to get the customers, but then Chinese government basically pressured those places to close down. So all those casinos have now closed, but they move further away from the Chinese border, right? So the ones that, for example, along the Lao border and the Chinese Myanmar border, the one later are moved down to the Thai Lao border, right, along the Mekong River, and there's a big one like King Romans. There's a big casino there. Similarly, you also have ones like moved down to Cambodia later on, but also the Chinese government pressured Cambodia government to kick it out, and then now they're moving out from Cambodia to other parts. And I saw the other day there was a piece that they say that some casinos have now moved into Karen state, along the Thai-Burmese border. So that's away from Chinese influence, right? It's on the Thai-Burmese border. But the target market is still the Chinese online gambling. Yeah, so it must be very profitable.
Yeah. And if I can just add then, so what's also an interesting kind of variable here is, so some countries will do China's bidding, Cambodia, as you mentioned, but other countries, I mean, even Duterte's Philippines, and Duterte is noted as the most pro-China, or at least the least critical of China of many past Philippine presidents, right? And yet even he is reluctant to close this down, which, by the way, is not just the gambling revenues, it's also the property market.
Right.
I mean, this is just, you know, had huge implications on property in Manila. And so there's just a lot of people profiting from this. And I can imagine in the situation in Karen State or wherever else these new places are being set up. And so the Chinese government can kind of try to squash it in one place and get a government, in case of Cambodia, quite dependent on China, but it will just move somewhere else, which again limits China. It's very interesting, the limits of Chinese power, as it were.
Right, but it's also quite difficult to do research on those things because they are, like, you know, run by mafias and.
Of course, but we know they're there, and we know that I mean, it symbolizes this limited control China has over these, and of course, for the Chinese developmental model, I mean, for those who aren't aware of this, capital controls are vital. They really need resources concentrated in China to continue their economic push. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question from Hunter.
Hi, thanks. Enze, I always really enjoy listening to your presentations, and thank you for your remarks tonight. I see your project's evolving very nicely, so brilliant and well done. I was going to ask a question earlier. I think Mark sort of touched upon my thinking with your framing this around the unintended consequences, right? And I'm wondering if it sort of overlooks the middlemen and the little guys on the border, you know, the opportunists who are seeking to leverage their positions as agents in trade and smuggling networks and capitalize on the market that China offers. So I'll sort of move my question in a different direction. I guess I'm wondering, is it primarily the size of China's markets and the numbers of people and customers, consumers coming across the border that's really driving this unique dominance in China's influence? You know, I'm thinking of Myanmar's geography. You have borders, large borders with India and Thailand as well. Are those specifically smaller because their market size is smaller, or is there something different driving that relationship? And sort of a second question relatedly, I tend to look at more of politics and Naypyidaw and foreign relations from the Myanmar government and the, you know, state-centric view that you're trying to get away from. But one relationship that I've been really interested in lately is Myanmar's what I think is sort of a new hedge against reliance on China by strengthening its relations with India more concertedly lately. So I'm wondering, do you see Myanmar's foreign policy as primarily driven by these sort of grassroots actors in the illicit economies, or is the state still centric in some ways? Thanks.
Okay. So the first question, and I think that's a very interesting question, in terms of you know, China's relation with Myanmar versus Myanmar's relation with Thailand and also with India. And I think in some ways, what I think fundamentally it is about economics of imbalance, right? So think about it, like previously, like in the, let's say in 70s, 80s, whatever, it's all about illegal trade across the Thai-Burmese border, right? And even since then, right? So there's a tremendous amount of smuggling going on between Thailand and Myanmar during the Cold War period when Myanmar shut down, right? And then Thailand was the main source of everyday products to the Myanmar market. Only recently Myanmar started to open up, and then you have a diversification of trade routes. But previously, the Thai market dominated Myanmar's internal consumer market, because that's only access. That's why, Myawaddy and Mesot, that's like main smuggling routes of things. So why not India? And as I said, that means basically there's not much economic interest between the two. So in some ways, what I'm saying is that in Thai's case, right, Thailand versus Myanmar, lots of like how should I say, small electronics, and then like consumer products like shampoos and whatever, you can still buy them in Myanmar supermarket, usually like written on in Thai, which means they're being smuggled through Thailand. But you will not see such a thing demand from Indian products because there's not much demand, either demand or market, right? So you need this kind of supply and then market kind of relationship to make it work, right? So similar things, I think the reason why it's happening with China, because China demand lots of products from Myanmar. Like for example, this cattle trade, right? The reason is because Myanmar has lots of cattle, but Burmese consumption of cattle, of beef, is very, very small. Because of religious reasons, most Burmese people don't want to eat beef, right? It's a Buddhist thing. So the only people who do eat beef is actually the Muslims, right? But they are such a small percentage of population. So that's why Myanmar has an over surplus like of cattle, right? Pork, chicken, yes, domestic consumption is quite high, but beef is very small. So that's why it's a natural kind of a symbiotic market, right? You have lots of cattle around, and you have big market who wants beef. So that's why it's a natural supply chain kind of destination. I went to China. India also does not eat beef, right? So it's the same story. Indians like cows are sacred, right? So people don't eat it. So I think that is this kind of logic, I think, basically make it difficult perhaps to increase economic transaction between India and Burma, because they're actually probably similar, predominantly agricultural, that not much of industrialization kind of products Myanmar really need from India, and vice versa. But I do think the relation between Myanmar and Thailand and Myanmar and China are different. So for example, like corn, for example, right now, lots of corns, instead of going to China, which being blocked, now many went to Thailand. So Thai also have big demand for corn, for its like for example in Hong Kong, you can buy lots of CP chicken and CP eggs, right? And they are, trust me, many of them probably originally from corns being fed by corn imported from Myanmar. CP does lots of this kind of regional chain of production. Now, your last question about foreign policy, hedging policy, and I think that makes sense, right? I mean, when you have economically have a dependent relation between Myanmar and China, or Myanmar with Thailand, I think that kind of economic relation is quite intense. Then it makes sense to, as a foreign policy, to hedge with further engagement with countries that you do not necessarily have that much economic relation, but it's worthwhile to have them around, right? So for me, that makes total sense to improve relations with India. But I don't think that means fundamentally the Myanmar government do not understand the economic logic of things, transactions going on between China and Myanmar, right? And that's why the Suu Kyi's government actually put lots of emphasis to facilitate lots of these deals with China to legalize the export-import mechanism, because the problem is that previously lots of things are not legalized, right? But they go away nonetheless, right? So why not just tax them and then make them illegal, right? So that's why the agreement I mentioned earlier that they were signed in earlier this year in 2020 tried to legalize the cattle trade. And there's also pressure from the Myanmar government side, try to legalize the corn trade with China, but China has refused to do so because corn is considered as a national food security grain kind of thing. That's why they refuse to do it. So that's why I think that for me to understand the foreign policy hedging on Myanmar, to engage further with India or with other countries, make perfect sense. But that does not negate they don't understand economic relations between Myanmar and its two large neighbors have lots of economic interactions with. Okay, so I got one question from Wang Zheng. So he asked, to what extent my argument can be generalized to other Southeast Asian countries, and what did I select Myanmar as your primary case? I think it definitely has wide implications to other parts of Southeast Asia. And I select Myanmar because this is a country that I do field work on. So that's why I'm quite familiar with the Myanmar case. But I can also venture that such dynamic exists in quite a few countries in Southeast Asia, particularly those ones on mainland of Southeast Asia that has much more intensive interactions with China. So for example, you can think of Thailand as well, right? So I mentioned lots of like agricultural demands for Chinese market is happening in Thailand as well as in Malaysia. Like for example, durian. It's a very special fruit, but right now 80% of Thai durian go to Chinese market. So this is like things like this will have deep implications as well for land rights and for modes of agriculture production in Thailand. And previously, for example, I heard lots of stories of like basically Chinese banana plantation going down to Thailand to lease land. So usually they produce this particular type of banana. Usually it's a Cavendish banana, which is a bigger one, like bigger, like long, usually like from Florida, like from Central America. But traditional Thai banana is small, very short and then like little, but that's sweeter. So that's why nowadays you have lots of those kind of plantation banana. They try to compete for domestic market in Thailand, and they try to promote them to say basically saying that those big bananas they're fragrant, even though they're not as sweet, but they're fragrant, and they try to like they call them like gui hom. It's basically this fragrant banana. They try to sell them to domestic market. So there's a lot of things like this happening as well. So I don't think it's unique to Myanmar. I think it's happening everywhere in Southeast Asia, depending on your interactions with China. And I think the presence, the political economy dynamic, is there, right? This is as long as you have a market demand and you have the supply, and then that create these kind of lots of incidents that people definitely experience. Yeah. So I would definitely encourage people to study other countries in any region, but also volunteer with your own knowledge of this. And I think you find probably lots of similarities.
Right. Well,
if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So a lot of the questions you had are about, in one way or another, relations between migrants and indigenous communities, and understandably so, given the kind of history of, colonial history of migration and the fact that nativism and anti-foreign sentiments have often been very strong in Myanmar. I just wanted to ask you, following up on these questions, can you give us a sense of how salient these issues are in national politics? There's an election coming up. Are people talking about migration from China or Myanmar-China relations? Is there much talk about this? Are candidates, religious organizations, parties, is that at all on the agenda, or are people just talking about other issues?
I think the best person to talk to is Renaud, not me. I don't usually follow that closely on Myanmar domestic policy or Myanmar elections. But I think Renaud is basically like an expert on Myanmar elections, right? So that I'm not expert on this, but I don't think it is actually. I think your question of whether China is a factor in Myanmar's election, I don't think it is. I think at least from my very limited observance of predominantly Facebook posts from my friends in Myanmar, nobody's talking about China really. It's sort of domestic, NLD versus some ethnic parties. People, some people who have ethnic orientation, they try to push for some ethnic parties to gain in certain territories, particularly in Rakhine, whatever. But that's it. I don't really see how foreign policy actually came out that prominently. I think lots of tension, but this year obviously because it's COVID, right? So lots of things about how the Myanmar government, the Suu Kyi's government is responding to the disease control, other things. But you know, Renaud, you can say something about this. I mean, I haven't come across how prominently China has been featured or foreign policy has been featured in this election.
Yeah, and I think it's there, but it's not just a top priority. I mean, there are other communities that are the targets. I mean, obviously the Rohingya and it's other countries that are more prominent, but it's there when you discuss with MPs, with politicians, they are concerned about the investment of the Chinese, particularly if you go to Kachin State or Shan State. You will hear that it's a concern nonetheless, but it's not prominent. So you don't hear politicians, candidates develop a public speech or political campaign around this Chinese influence. But nonetheless, it's there.
Yeah, but I also have to say though, our influence, and there is definitely intentional influence here, is that if you look at recent UN human rights groups that basically the ones, you know, there's one came out and one's condemning China on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, etc. And you have the other party, right? Another groups of countries came out to support Chinese positions on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang. Myanmar was there. And Myanmar actually made a statement in the UN on that. So I think it's a quid pro quo. And China did that for Rohingya, and that's why Myanmar is coming back to repay the favor. And that's why Myanmar made a statement. Myanmar government made a statement in supporting China's position on Hong Kong's internal politics, and then also on Xinjiang as well. And that, for me, is a direct influence, foreign policy-wise.
Our time is drawing to a close. We have time for maybe just one more very quick question, or shall we call it a day? Is there somebody asking for a question?
So there's one more question from Hunter. Talk about infrastructure, whether lack of physical infrastructure between Myanmar and India is a factor, and I think yes. Yes and no, right? I mean, so I think infrastructure often is built by people, right? So in some ways, it's a chicken egg question, right? If you have need, then you build roads. If you don't have a need, then you don't build roads, right? So that means that in Thailand, in the case of Thai-Myanmar relations, right? So the Myawaddy sort of that border area is very frequent, right? And that's why the Thai government also understand that a lot of things going on in Myanmar. They try to access Myanmar's Andaman Sea. They try to build those what is it called, the gas pipelines, and then and also you try to make it the east-west corridor, right? That's connecting the Kanchanaburi province with Bangkok, etc. It's all part of Thai government design to tap into this ongoing economic relation with Myanmar. But I think that's because, so for me, that's an egg and chicken question, right? Which one comes first? But why there's so little going on in India, between India and Myanmar? And I think partly because northeastern part of India is of limited control even by the Indian government, right? So you have a lot more let's say that's the ongoing insurgency, perhaps in some parts, like in Nagaland or something. And then I think there's also something going on in Mizoram, other places. So that's why I think probably it's very unstable economically speaking, right? Politically speaking. And then in terms of, so that's why the infrastructure has not come, right? And Indian state has talked about having a going east foreign policy, but then if you read the actual things happening, is very little, right? Usually they say they're gonna build a bridge, but then many years later they're still talking about the same bridge. So it's like that. So so I think there is the kind of probably lack of enough potential for the eastern part of India to develop that kind of connection with Myanmar. So rather than with the Thai or the Chinese one.
Very good. I'm very pleased indeed, not only with your fascinating talk, Enze, but also with our very lively discussion. And I would have to say, Experiment webinar was a success. And we thank you very much for being the experimenter, as it were.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
This out. Our pleasure. And thank you again for coming. And as I said, we hope to have you live and in person in the near person. And as I think we've been able to demonstrate, there is quite a bit of interest in Southeast Asia through such a webinar. And we wish you obviously good luck with the rest of your research.
Okay, thank you.
And so at this point, to everyone else, thank you for coming. And this is, at this point, the only scheduled webinar for the semester, but please have a look at our website for future events coming soon. Also, please, if you haven't registered, please do so we can send you regular email alerts. Thank you again.
All right, thank you.
And we'll catch up again soon. Thank you all for participating.